Uh, your opening statement, Dr. Barry Brummett.
Yes, thank you, and what an honor it is to be here today and to share the stage, albeit electronically, with Mr. Hitchens. It is, of course, Mr. Hitchens' long legacy and work in attacking the extremisms of religion, which provide the framework for us to be here tonight. So I think my prepared remarks are going to try to address our resolution within that context, and then in my 5 minutes later on, I'll talk more about his, I thought, very interesting statements. At the start of his celebrated treatise on rhetoric, Aristotle makes a very interesting distinction. He says, on the one hand, we have decisions that we have to make for which we have no sure and certain systems to guide us. Who do you vote for? What do I do about my interpersonal relationships? Do I spank my kid? Do I buy that used car? And he says, because we have no sure and certain systems for those kinds of decisions, we have to talk it out, and that means that we have to turn to rhetoric and dialectic, he said. And I think our descendants' rhetoric and dialectic today would include, although not be limited to, such activities as literature, television, film, and so forth. Many of us get clues as to how to live those parts of our lives from those sources. On the other hand, he says, we have decisions to make for which we do have sure and certain systems to guide us. If you want to know the area of a circle, you take a measurement, you apply the formula. No one debates about the area of a circle, okay? Seems like a very reasonable sort of distinction. But I think it sets up a great temptation, and that is the temptation to move managements of our everyday issues from rhetoric and dialectic and the messiness that that involves over to sure and certain systems, right? Because wouldn't you really like someone to tell you once and for all what you should do in life? Wouldn't you like someone to tell you whether you should spank your child or not? Otherwise, you do the wrong thing, and then 20 years later, the kid climbs a library tower with a .30-06, and it's your fault. I take from this great temptation what I would call a rhetorical definition of extremism. And I think rhetorically, extremism is what happens when people assert that they have a sure and certain system to guide decisions, which really ought to be made through rhetorical and dialectic and cultural means. And let me just say in general, I think that having looked at Mr. Hitchens' work over the years, I think I am probably appalled by many of the same things that he is appalled by. But I think I find a different causality. And I want to talk about extremisms as being that causality, but not only religious extremisms. I think extremisms, both religious and secular, are the source of many of our problems. And I think if we don't understand that, then we will not understand religions which are not extremist, and we will not see secular belief systems which are extremist. When I talk about extremism, I want to look at the form or the pattern of extremism. I think that's more important than the content of religious or secular extremisms. And I want to point to three kinds of form that I think underlie this sort of extremism. The first is what I would call dogmatic fundamentalism. And that's what happens when someone is a prophet, when someone has found some sort of secular text, and they attempt to treat that as a sure and certain system which will tell us absolutely what we should do in life. Now, obviously, you find that in religious circles, in religious belief. But I think you find it elsewhere also. And let me just give one sort of example. I've known many people who began life with a very dogmatic and fundamentalist upbringing. And then later in life, they just couldn't do that anymore. They could not hold to those religious beliefs. But they shifted that sort of dogmatic fundamentalism to something else. In my experience, most often health. And they grab hold of some sort of health doctrine and health text, and they become as dogmatic as any primitive Baptist preacher telling you, what you should do, except now it's about what you ought to eat as opposed to what you ought to believe. So I think dogmatic fundamentalism is the first kind of extremism in the sense that I mean it. Secondly, I would point to apocalyptic belief, and I've done some research on this. An apocalyptic belief is what happens when someone gets hold of some ancient or grounding text and they say, I have a sure and certain system for understanding this text, and it means the world is going to end next Wednesday. In the United States, at any rate, we just had Harold Camping, a minister, tell us that the world is going to end on May 21st. Sadly, for students preparing for final exams, it did not. Now he says, well, it's October 21st, but this time he really means it. I think that's an extremism, and I think it's offering as a sure and certain text something that you really can't know as a sure and certain text. In fact, the Bible says you can't, but that doesn't stop people like the Reverend Camping. In my study of apocalyptic, what has fascinated me, though, is I've looked at all kinds of apocalyptic discourse. People who think the world will end because of World War III, or ecological matters, or economic matters, or you name it, and they all follow the same form or pattern. I think this is something deeply ingrained in people. And finally, the tendency towards perfection, or what is sometimes called teleology. Of course, there is no perfection in nature, but people will sometimes give you the advice as to how one can perfect oneself. And I think some ways of thinking are more disposed toward perfectionism than others. Now here I think Mr. Hitchens is definitely onto something, because I think religion is one of those areas which lends itself toward perfectionism, toward thinking that one can come up with a perfect solution to life's problems. But I don't think it's the only one. I think it's a pattern that we find. Well, what's to be done? And again, because this is a conference on rhetoric and because I'm a rhetorician, I want to offer three rhetorical solutions as to how we can address this problem of extremism, whether we find it in religious circles or non-religious circles. The first thing that I would suggest is to turn to rhetoric's long and somewhat uneven tradition of both affirmation and critique. Rhetoric has, throughout history, taught people what they ought to say so they can affirm something, so they can defend some sort of proposition, so they can get up in a speech and say what they think they believe. But rhetoric has also taught people how to critique and how to think about what is wrong with this proposition, where are the holes in this. I think a lot of what you see in people who are being extremist for one reason or another, perhaps, is a failure of that second kind of training. But it really is a kind of rhetorical education. And I think people who are in the job of educating need to think about how to train people, both how do you say yes, and how do you say I'm not so sure. Second thing is, I think we need to train people in the schools as to how to exploit the resources of ambiguity. Now, religion has a long history of being able to do this very well. It's called casuistry. But any religious system, in fact any system whatsoever that's going to last for any period of time, is going to have ambiguities. And they provide a way to exploit that system and to suggest alternative ways of thinking. But people need to be trained in how to exploit those ambiguities. Religion depends on this. No religion is going to last more than 2 weeks if it tells you that you must wear a pointed yellow hat every Thursday evening at 5 o'clock. None of them are that specific. They are all vague. They are all ambiguous. And exploiting that is one way that you can do that. If you want a literary, cultural example of that, look at Inherit the Wind and look at the ways in which the character of Clarence Darrow exploited the ambiguities in William Jennings Bryan's fundamentalism, and I think that provides a good example. The last solution I would suggest is to go sophistic, to become sophist, and the sophists cultivated the study of what was called the dissoi logoi, which is to say there are two sides to every question. And before you get up to speak on any question, think about what could be said on the other side of that question. One of my favorite authors, his book is rather old now, but Mark Bachman wrote a book called Sophistication. I highly recommend it. He argues that we have become sophists in our time. I would say perhaps not enough and not enough of us. But I think training people to be able to say that whatever it is that you affirm, whatever it is that you are inclined to visit upon other people as this is a true way to think, stop and ask yourself, what's the other way to think? What could be said on the other side? And that's very much a rhetorical way of thinking. Always think about what can be said on both sides of the question. Again, I think I'll reserve for my second statement some answers to what I thought were Mr. Hitchens' very interesting and provocative remarks, and I will now yield the rest of my time, as they say.
Well, you just you came in at 9:56, so you yielded 4 seconds. But that was quite remarkable. Either you're very, very good at timing your comments, or you're very lucky. But well done. There are your opening statements.